A sharp, piercing clang of bells plunges into the black veil of sleep, tearing it like a coarse blade through fine silk. It echoes in every cell of your body, pulling you from oblivion. Your breath, escaping your lungs, instantly turns into a pale cloud in the frigid dormitory air. Small fingers, already numb from the cold, awkwardly cling to the rough wool of the habit. Its weight presses on your shoulders, and the scratchy fabric scrapes your skin as you pull it over your head, trying to quell the tremor shaking your entire body. You are only 7 years old. Bare feet, pricked and frostbitten, have long lost sensation to the icy touch of the stone floor. They feel alien, only vaguely aware of the rough surface you walk on every day. Around you, like spectral shadows, 20 other girls glide silently. Their faces, pale and expressionless, like frozen candle wax, are barely discernible in the meager grey light filtering through the narrow embrasures of the windows. Not a single rustle, not a single sigh disturbs this oppressive, all-consuming silence. In the far corner of the dormitory, a tiny figure, barely 5 years old, clumsily struggles with her habit. Her tiny fingers tremble, tangling in the folds of the coarse fabric that seems impossibly vast to her. An impulse, like a hot wave, surges through your body. You want to rush to her, to help, to comfort. But instantly, like a bucket of icy water, the memory of Margaret crashes over you. Just a week ago, her quiet whisper, words of comfort spoken to a crying child, had been overheard. 3 days of complete deprivation, without a crumb of bread, without a drop of water. 3 days on her knees, in the chapel, on dried peas scattered across the cold marble floor, each hard pellet dug into her flesh like a tiny blade, until dark spots of blood seeped through her thin stockings. This is not a school. This is not an orphanage. This is Whitby Abbey in Yorkshire, England. The year of our Lord 1247, and you are not here by choice. You are merely a pawn in a ruthless game, a bargaining chip in your father's political intrigues, for he desperately needed an alliance with the church. Your childhood, carefree and bright, ended the moment the massive oak doors slammed shut behind you 6 months ago, with a dull, final thud. That sound still echoes within you, like a funeral bell. You will never again see your mother's face, nor feel her tender embrace. You will never again run through endless fields, feeling the wind in your hair and freedom in every breath. Laughter, light and carefree, without anyone's permission, is now but a distant echo in your memory. Honey cakes, their sweet, sticky taste and spicy aroma, have become a forbidden memory. The warmth of a hearth, the comforting crackle of logs, and the gentle touch of family hands. All of this remained forever beyond the walls that now separate you from the world. Instead, for the next 10 years, you will learn a single lesson. Survival here demands absolute, unquestioning obedience. You will learn that hunger is not torment, but a path to holiness, that every growling spasm in your stomach brings you closer to the Lord. And silence will become your only unspoken friend, guarding you from inevitable punishment. Dawn brings neither warmth nor hope. It arrives with the first sharp clang of the bell, precisely at 4 in the morning. Only a grey, indifferent morning, portending merely a new succession of duties, an endless routine from which there is no escape. Tiny children, barely 5 years old, struggle to rise from their hard, damp-smelling straw pallets. Their small bodies, stiff from sleeping on perpetually icy stone floors, move clumsily, stumbling in the dim light. In these rooms, where every breath you take turns into a tiny misty sigh, and rat shadows silently scurry between the chipped stones of the walls, you learn to live. You know there are many places like this. You understand that your fate is not unique. For instance, at Shaftesbury Abbey in Dorset, founded as early as 88 AD, girls from noble families languished in similar dormitories, given away like unwanted furniture. You recall the story of Lady Githa of Mercia, who in 1043 AD sent her youngest daughter, Edith, here when she was barely 4 years old. You realize that political alliances demanded sacrifices, and children, especially daughters, were merely pawns in the ruthless game of medieval power. In the dry lines of the Abbey's chronicles, meticulously penned in Latin by Abbess Elfgifu, only fragments of one story survived. The story of little Edith, Parvula, 3 days, 3 nights. Her thin, heart-rending wail echoed against the high stone vaults, dissolving into indifferent silence. Tears, hot and salty, streamed down her cheeks, freezing in the morning cold. They turned into tiny, sharp, frozen beads, pricking her tender skin. "Mama! Mama!" burst from her throat in crude Saxon. But here, within these walls, only Latin was spoken. Her cries, full of anguish and pain, found no answer. No one understood her words. No one wanted to. She had to learn. Her mother was now dead, dead to her, and only God remained her sole father. Cold, distant, silent. The first weeks were a continuous descent. Stumbling, they learned to live anew. Just yesterday, their lavender-scented hair had been meticulously braided by the gentle fingers of their maids. Now it was roughly shorn, in clumps, the scissors screeching as they cut the strands close to the root. The cold air touched their exposed scalps, leaving a sensation of naked vulnerability. No vanity, no beauty. The soft silk of their dresses, which had caressed their skin, was gone forever. It was replaced by scratchy wool habits. Every movement was torture. The coarse fabric chafed, leaving red, itching marks on their unaccustomed tender skin, like 1,000 tiny needles. Their hands, once protected by delicate gloves, remained bare, cold, constant labor. Their skin cracked, bled, red threads on pale palms. Pain was an unceasing companion. Years later, Lady Matilda Fitzwalter, sent to Godstow Abbey near Oxford in 1185, when she was only 6, wrote to her sister. Her letter, secretly smuggled beyond the walls, breathed a quiet melancholy. She remembered the taste. Sweet, sticky marzipan melted on her tongue, leaving an almond aftertaste. Remembered the touch, the soft, silky brush of ermine against her cheek. Now, only the taste of bland, viscous barley gruel, settling heavily on her tongue. And the touch, only coarse hemp against her skin, stiff, scratching. Sometimes, through the monotony of the days, she wondered, were those early memories just dreams? Too vivid, too unreal? This stone world, cold and silent, seemed too tangible, too real, for any other life to have preceded it. Silence here was not golden. It was survival. Thick, palpable, it pressed on their ears, filled their lungs, permeated the deepest recesses of their consciousness. From the first sharp clang of the morning bell, cleaving the pre-dawn gloom, until the last fading echo of the evening bell, speaking was forbidden. Forbidden, unless it pertained to lessons, delivered in a monotone voice, or confession, whispered in the dim light. The girls learned to communicate without words. Their eyes became mirrors. A single glance could say everything. A subtle, barely perceptible arrangement of fingers during prayer. A careful turn of the body in the refectory, where every rustle seemed deafening. A bowed head, not humility, but hunger, a gnawing, aching hunger. A particular way of holding a prayer book, slightly tighter than necessary, a sign of illness, chills, weakness, hidden beneath the habit, and a specific posture during Mass, when shoulders drooped lower than usual and gaze drifted nowhere. That was despair. Deep, silent. Unbearable. At Barking Abbey in Essex, discipline was severe, ruthless. There, silence was broken, but not by words, only by sound. The sharp, stinging sound of leather striking flesh. The punishment room was small, stone, cold. Every sound within it was amplified, echoing off the bare walls. Girls were taken here, taken for the slightest infractions, for a slight, involuntary smile that flickered across their lips during monotonous prayer, for a movement too slow, a barely perceptible lag in procession, for any expression of self, for anything that was alive, for anything that was human. And every strike emanating from that room was an echo of fear permeating every cell of the body, a silent warning. Do not dare, do not feel, do not be. The heavy binding of the Liber Correctionis, the Book of Corrections, felt cold against her fingers, like stone. Each page meticulously inscribed by Sister Manar, the keeper of discipline, was filled not with ink, but with pain. The scratch of her quill seemed to pierce their very bones, recording every transgression, every breath that deviated from the rules. It was not merely a list, it was a catalogue, seared into the hearts of the children. The icy air of the chapel, a sudden, almost inaudible giggle, like the fluttering of a butterfly. Alicia, only 7, couldn't suppress it. It escaped, thin as a thread, and instantly ceased. 5 sharp strokes of the birch. Each one resonated with a burning pain, piercing her thin skin, forcing her to whimper, but not dare to utter a sound. Through tear-blurred eyes, she saw only the blurry silhouettes of the sisters, their faces, frozen masks of condemnation. Later, the whisper of 9-year-old Margarita, during scripture reading, seemed to chime in the silence like a bell, portending 15 strokes, each one searing, leaving welts on her thin back. And Beatrice, a tiny 5-year-old, who innocently wet the bed, felt cold, strong hands gripping his wrists as 10 strokes whistled through the air, descending upon his buttocks, leaving sharp pain and a sticky, humiliating fear. These were not accidents, not rare bursts of anger. This was a daily, monotonous rhythm. Every dawn brought not only pallid light, but also an unshakable, heart-clenching fear. It stirred in their stomachs like a hungry beast, making them recoil, clench their lips, hide their eyes. The children lived in constant anticipation, in a sticky dread of making a mistake they couldn't comprehend. What was sin? What was transgression? The air was permeated with invisible threads of surveillance, each one seemingly ready to tighten and snap, bringing new pain. Joanna, the youngest daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine herself, was cast into these walls at the age of 11, at Fontevraud, in France. Her thin, trembling letters to her mother, discovered centuries later, whispered of a soul slowly, agonizingly breaking under this burden. "Dear Mother," she wrote, and the letters seemed to tremble on the parchment. "I have learned to move like a shadow, so my footsteps are unheard, and to breathe like a whisper, so I do not disturb the silence. Yesterday, I was beaten because my thoughts wandered during matins. How do they know? How do they enter my mind? I fear they can see my thoughts. I fear they can see my dreams of home, of your laughter, of the scent of freshly cut grass, and the warm touch of the sun on my skin. I fear they will take even that. This fear was palpable. It was a cold sweat on her skin, a tremor in her knees, a silent scream caught in her throat. Food was not sustenance. It was part of the punishment, a tool of control. Once a day, sometimes twice if they were lucky, meager portions appeared on wooden platters, grey, tasteless gruel, sticky and cold. Black bread, hard as stone, crumbling in their hands, leaving a bitter taste in their mouths, and water, cold, lifeless. The prohibition on meat hung in the air like a heavy shroud. Only on the greatest feast days did it appear on the tables, and even then, merely a tiny, meagre scrap, just to remind them of its absence. At Wilton Abbey in Wiltshire, breakfast was little more than a mockery, a small, thin piece of bread, crumbling in their fingers, and a cup of water. For dinner, barley gruel, sometimes with a few pale, tasteless vegetables grown in the monastery garden. Children arriving from their noble homes, still remembering the taste of succulent fruits and roasted meat, quickly changed. Their cheeks hollowed, leaving sharp cheekbones. Their eyes seemed too large, too deep, too dark for their emaciated faces. Their skin grew thin, almost translucent, stretched taut over their bones. Their movements slowed. Every step required effort, but the hunger was intentional. It was not a mistake, but a deliberate discipline, a way to subjugate the body to God's will, to purify the soul. So claimed the abbesses, their voices as hard as stone. But they did not acknowledge, or perhaps did not wish to acknowledge, that hungry children could not focus on prayers. Emptiness buzzed in their heads, thoughts scattered like smoke. Colored spots swam before their eyes. They could not learn effectively. The words of Scripture blurred, meaning eluded them. Their thoughts, their dreams, their every moment were obsessed with one thing: food. They hid crumbs of bread in the folds of their clothing, their fingers nervously feeling the fabric, dreaming of feasts, of the smell of warm bread, of succulent meat, of sweet fruits. Dreams of salvation gave way to tormenting, vivid, almost palpable visions of food that haunted them like shadows throughout every hungry day. Agnes of Bohemia, daughter of King Ottokar I, was sent to Prague, to the Poor Clares Monastery. She was 8 years old. The cold of stone, the scent of unfamiliar dust, and old incense enveloped her from that very day in 1234. Her confessor, Brother Francis, wrote to the king, his words like barbs. "Your daughter speaks only of food. She counts the hours between meals. She weeps not for your absence, your majesty. Her tears are memories of succulent roasted game, of thick, sweet mead. This is not piety, believe me. This is pure, unmitigated despair that gnaws at her from within." Winter in these stone fortresses was particularly harsh. The cold seeped through the thick walls, clung to their clothing, crept under their skin. Heating was minimal, with only small flames dancing in the chapter house fireplaces and perhaps in the scriptorium. But the dormitories, long echoing sleeping quarters, remained unheated. Even when snow piled high against the windows in dense, muffled drifts and thick, creaking ice formed on nearby bodies of water, a deathly cold reigned within. The children slept in communal beds, huddled together, seeking any semblance of warmth. Often 3 or 4 to a narrow, rustling straw mattress, their small bodies clustered into a single, shivering mass. At Unquestioning Abbey in Winchester, The dormitory was a long, narrow hall without a single window. Only one small fireplace flickered at the far end, its faint warmth dissolving into the icy air, never reaching the sleepers. The girls went to bed fully clothed, layering on every piece of coarse fabric they possessed. Yet, every morning they awoke with frostbite on their fingers and toes. Numbed skin, piercing pain as blood returned to blue-tipped extremities. Lady Isabella de Clare, sent to Amesbury Abbey in Wiltshire in 1248 at the tender age of 6, recalled years later in her memoirs, "I remember the sound of chattering teeth in the darkness, like tiny castanets played by invisible icy hands. I remember the girl beside me, Marie. She was barely 5, and she had come from Normandy. She spoke no English, and every night her quiet weeping for her nurse filled the dormitory's darkness. One February morning, she did not wake. Her lips were blue as violets, and her skin cold as stone. She was carried away while we recited morning prayers, and we never spoke of her again, as if she had never existed, as if that small, shivering body had never been beside me. Death was commonplace, unremarkable. It caused no surprise. Children faded from the cold, their lungs burned with consumption, their bodies wasted from malnutrition, their souls broke from despair. Abbey records, dry and unemotional, show a horrifying mortality rate among girls under 10, almost 30%. These deaths were recorded matter-of-factly, without a single emotion, without questions, without investigations. A simple statement of fact. At Shaftesbury Abbey, in the list of deceased for 1209, it reads, Johanna, 5 years old, died of fever on the feast of St. Michael. Margarita, 7 years old, died of exhaustion on the feast of St. Luke. Beatrice, 6 years old, died of consumption on the feast of St. Martin. No surnames. Not a single word to their parents. No elaborate funerals. They were buried in unmarked graves in the monastic cemetery. Their short, cut-off lives were reduced to these brief, indifferent entries in ledgers, as if they were merely figures, vanished from the accounts. In the dim light that filtered through the high, narrow windows, the air felt thick, permeated with the scent of old parchment, wax, and stale dust. Here, within these ancient walls, education was not a light, but merely a dim reflection, barely enough to guide their eyes across the lines of a prayer book. The heavy, crudely bound book felt oppressive on their small, unformed fingers, and the Latin words, written in ornate script, merged into an endless, monotonous drone. Most children learned only to recognize the shapes of letters, so their voices could merge with the choir, repeating psalms whose meaning remained hidden behind the barrier of an unfamiliar tongue. Writing only for the few, the chosen, whose destinies were already predetermined, assigned to scriptoria or administrative cells. Their fingers, perhaps, felt the cold, smooth quill, and their ears caught the scratch of ink on rough paper. But for the rest, it remained a mystery. Mathematics, history, science. These words would have sounded like alien whispers here, dangerous, capable of unsettling God's inscrutable mysteries. At Lecoq Abbey in Wiltshire, founded in 1229, each day was woven from repetitions. Psalms, endless, monotonous, beat out the rhythm of life. Hands, still unformed, learned to embroider, and the sharp prick of the needle was a constant companion, leaving tiny, barely visible drops of blood on the fine threads intended for adorning church vestments. Hours spent, hunched over embroidery hoops, caused a dull ache in their backs, but no one dared straighten up until the bell rang. Stories of holy women, their suffering and humility, were absorbed with every breath, every movement, like the cold permeating their bones from the perpetually damp stone walls. Obedience through scripture, patience through needlework, humility through suffering. These words, carved into the rule of the founder, Lady Ayla of Salisbury, were not just rules, but the very fabric of their existence. Not a word about arithmetic, not a sound about medicine, not a glimpse of any books other than those that led to salvation. They were taught not to think, but merely to obey without question. Physical punishment was not merely the norm, it was part of atonement. The strap, the birch, the discipline of fasting, instruments of salvation, sharp and merciless. The air might shiver with the sharp whistle of the rod, followed by a dull, wet thud. A sensation of burning, throbbing pain on the skin, then a rapidly spreading flush of humiliation. Any display of independence, a spark of creativity, or even a hint of a question seemed mortally dangerous. They were suppressed, beaten, until they were broken, until nothing remained but subservience. At Dartford Priory in Kent, founded in 1355, the rule was etched in invisible letters into every stone, every movement. Spare the rod, for through suffering, the young soul learns to love God above all earthly things. The prioress, Dame Joan Vaux, was known throughout England for her severity. In her cell, in the dim light, she kept a collection of willow rods, each thin, flexible, and each marked with the name of one of the girls under her care. The dry, grassy scent of willow mingled with the smell of fear. Parents who came to visit their daughters could not help but notice the livid welts on their thin arms, on their pale backs, peeking from beneath the coarse fabric. But their lips remained tightly sealed, and their eyes downcast. To challenge the prioress was to challenge God himself. Sister Marguerite of Hainaut, novice mistress at Poissy Abbey in France, from 1298 to 1315, kept a personal diary. Every word in it was written with a firm, confident hand. "Today I struck young Blanche 20 times," she recorded, and the sound of her quills scraping the parchment was as cold and detached as her words. 20 blows, each strike sharp, merciless, each strike an echo of her own conviction. Blanche was only 8, and her question, so innocent, so desperate, was steeped in bitterness. Why does God permit suffering? Why did my younger brother die if God loves children? Tears streamed down the girl's face, mixing with dirt and dust. Her small body trembled with pain, but the question, asked from the depths of childish grief, was dangerous. Such questions lead to doubt, and doubt is the enemy of faith. Better for her to learn through pain than through reason, for reason leads to perdition. And in the silence of the cell, broken only by the scratch of the quill, this thought seemed a definitive, undeniable truth. Deep, heavy sleep. It never lasted long. A sudden, piercing clang of the bell, tearing through the silence, vibrating in their very bones. Midnight. Matins. Cold. Always cold. The coarse wool of the habits scraped their skin, and the stone floor, damp and slick, dug into their bare feet. The shuffling of bodies, a collective sigh. Eyelids, heavy as lead, struggled to lift, trying to focus on the flickering candlelight, and then, just as the body sank into something resembling rest, another clang. 3 hours later. Lords, the air, thick with the scent of damp stone and stale breath, offered no solace. Limbs ached, a dull, relentless pain. Consciousness, A hazy landscape yearned for the oblivion of true sleep. And then the first pale hint of dawn, and yet another clang. Prime, each chime, a hammer blow, penetrating deep into their exhausted bodies. Growing bodies, already emaciated, already trembling, were now stretched upon the rack of endless wakefulness. A constant, gnawing hunger for sleep, an empty, aching sensation, deeper than any hunger for food. At Godstow Abbey, where the whisper of Rosamond Clifford's name still clung to the ancient stones, the bells rang with relentless frequency, too often, so often that the children began to move without truly waking, a strange walking sleep. The clang echoed not in their minds, but in their muscles, a silent command. They rose with slow, uncoordinated effort, their feet finding the cold floor. Eyes, wide and glassy, stared into the darkness, seeing nothing, just a vacant, unseeing gaze. Voices, thin and reedy, joined the general monotone hum. The chanting learned through countless, exhausting repetitions without comprehension. Words, empty sounds, fell from their lips, a stream of sounds without meaning. Their bodies swayed, a chorus of pale shadows moving through the pre-dawn cold, driven by a rhythm they no longer controlled. Years later, Lady Alice Fitzhugh, who spent 12 long years within these very walls, put quill to parchment. Her hand, perhaps, still trembled with the ghost of cold. "I learned to pray while my body slept," she wrote to her niece, "to drop onto cold stone knees, guided only by habit, while my mind, a desperate butterfly, flew away. It sought the sun. It sought the forgotten warmth on my skin, the bright shimmer of a summer day, the echo of laughter that once danced in the air, light and free. We were puppets, you see. Every morning, the bells, with their insistent metallic voices, wound us up. They set us in motion. A mechanical twitch, a practiced genuflection. I lived in constant gnawing fear. What if they stopped? What if the bells, those relentless masters, ever fell silent? Would I just collapse? Would I forget how to move, how to breathe, how to simply be without their cruel, constant command? The very air of the abbey seemed to stifle them. Emotional bonds, the tender threads that linked heart to heart, were not merely discouraged, they were brutally severed. A cold doctrine, whispered in hushed tones, then spoken aloud with relentless certainty, permeated every corner. Love for family, idolatry, sin, a dark stain on the soul, friendship, that fragile comfort, that shared warmth, greed, a path to damnation. Any glimmer of attachment to the outside world, to a beloved toy, a familiar scent, a glimpse of the sun through a window, a chain, a heavy binding chain, dragging the soul away from salvation. Each lesson, a cold blade, cutting deeper and deeper into their soft, vulnerable core. At Elstow Abbey, a place that would one day stir the soul of John Bunyan, a different torment unfolded. Here, the very idea of a special friend was a forbidden whisper. Girls who reached out for a hand, for a shared secret, were sharply separated. Their straw pallets, their thin blankets, were moved from dormitory to dormitory, a constant, unsettling reshuffling. There was no time to weave tender threads of affection, no room for whispered comfort in the dark. Letters from home, those precious fragments of connection, were not personal treasures. Oh no, they were confiscated, held aloft, and read aloud to the entire silent community. Every word, every tender sentiment was exposed, put on display. No private solace, no quiet peace, and gifts, a small carved bird, a ribbon, a handful of dried berries, confiscated. Their small hands, outstretched in anticipation, fell empty. These tokens of love, these fragile proofs of remembrance, were then shared, distributed evenly, so that none, not one of them, could ever feel the warm, singular embrace of individual care, of love meant only for them. The very idea of being cherished, of being unique, was systematically erased. Dame Clementia, who ruled Barking Abbey with an iron will, forged a doctrine of spiritual detachment. Her voice, sharp as a winter wind, cut through the silence. The girls were forbidden to speak, forbidden even to whisper of their families, of the lives they had known before these walls swallowed them whole. The past, she proclaimed, her gaze sweeping over their young, anxious faces, is death. Her words hung heavy in the air, a shroud. Only the present, only ceaseless service to God. That is all that matters. And then a chilling declaration. Those who linger on earthly attachments, they will find no peace, no solace in prayer, only torment. And so the girls tried. They tried to forget the warmth of a mother's hand, the scent of home, the sound of a father's laughter. They tried to empty their minds, to sever the very roots of who they were, hoping, desperately hoping, that in this barren void they would finally find the elusive peace promised by a God who seemed to demand everything. The cold, damp air clung to their small bodies, chilling them to the bone. Every whispered name, every mention of a mother's face, a brother's laughter, was a transgression, a condemnation. The door slammed shut with a metallic clang, its echo dissolving into the vast silence of the stone cell. Here, in the gloom, only the dull thud of a heart against ribs broke the stillness. Bread, hard and dry, scraped a parched tongue. Water, cold and thin, offered only phantom solace. Days blurred into weeks. The smell of mold and stagnant air filled their lungs, a constant reminder of captivity. Maud, only 7 years old, confined to Icknield Priory, fought against this obliteration. Her small fingers clutched an invisible diary as she tried to grasp the fading image. Her mother's face, it melted away like morning mist. Each day it grew dimmer, more indistinct. Sister Agatha, her voice dry as an autumn leaf, insisted that this was good, that it was necessary, that love for God must supplant all earthly affections. But Maud felt no love, only this all-consuming emptiness, as if something precious, alive, had been carved from her chest with a dull, jagged knife. She learned to feign. Her lips whispered prayers, her eyes downcast in feigned humility. But inside, behind the thin mask of piety, she felt only cold and desolation. The body remembered. It remembered the sharp, stinging blow. Not for a great sin, no, for a clumsy step, for looking too long out a window. For a sob that escaped involuntarily. At Romsey Abbey, where the future St. Christina sought refuge, each day was filled with anticipation of correction. This word, uttered with a gentle smile, concealed pain, a pinch to the ear that made her head ring, a slap to the palm, leaving a red mark, a stinging, humiliating slap to the cheek. The children learned. They learned to withdraw their hands at the slightest movement. They learned to cast down their eyes, to avoid meeting gazes. They learned to fall silent. Breath became invisible. Words caught in their throats. Only when addressed could a thin, frightened voice escape. Fear hung in the air, thick, palpable, like dust in a sunbeam. It seeped under their skin, constricted their muscles, forcing them to shrink into a small, inconspicuous huddle. The scriptorium at Shaftesbury Abbey smelled of old paper and dry ink. Here, in the silence, young Adelheid traced fine lines on parchment. Her fingers, still childish, trembled. She adorned the pages, adding vibrant colors, glints of gold. But in the margins, in the most hidden corners, where the eye barely noticed, she drew tiny, barely discernible figures, children, bent as if under the weight of an invisible burden, their hands pressed to their mouths to make no sound, eyes vast, wide open in a silent scream, and tears, thin dark streaks flowing down tiny faces. These drawings, hidden for centuries, were found only many, many years later. They were a cry, soundless, too terrifying to utter aloud. Pain, fear, despair, all contained within fragile, almost invisible strokes. Secrets whispered in confessionals, dissolving into the scent of incense and the cold of stone. At Wherwell Abbey, Father Edmund the Confessor felt his heart grow heavy with each word. Girls, very young, their voices barely audible, spoke of touches, of hands that roamed where they shouldn't, of nights when they were made to sleep beside older sisters, for warmth. But this warmth burned. It left a sticky, foul stain on their skin. It destroyed innocence, leaving only confusion and shame in its place. Father Edmund did not know what to say, how to advise. The girls were afraid of punishment if they dared resist, if they dared to tell. But their souls, he felt it, their pure souls, were irrevocably damaged by these nocturnal shadows, these silent, terrible secrets. He could only listen and feel their fragile world slowly, agonizingly crumble. The stone breathes cold. It penetrates the bones, settles on the skin as a sticky, invisible dampness. Within the walls of Stow Abbey, where time dragged slowly like old, dull incense, Dame Agnes of Huntingdon, the abbess, ruled with an iron hand. From 1257 to 1281, her name was whispered with apprehension. Parchments rustled, fragments of accusations surfaced. Several noble families dared to raise their voices, their words, like clods of mud, flying through the air. Indecent behavior, practices corrupting the innocent. Letters between Bishop Hugh of Lincoln and the Archbishop of Canterbury smelled of ink and fear, carrying that chilling echo. But suddenly, all fell silent. The clink of coins, heavy, low, muffled the whispers. Agnes made substantial financial donations, and those who dared to speak were threatened with excommunication, cold as the breath of death. Their voices drowned in the silence, deep, bottomless. In 1284, at Canonsley Abbey in Devon, the air was saturated with dampness and despair. Lady Isabella de Fours, daughter of the powerful Earl of Devon, slept a restless sleep, listening to every rustle. The darkness here was thick, dense. It pressed, suffocated. And then they came, invisible, elusive, hands, evil touches in the dark. She recoiled, holding her breath, feeling the rough wool of the nun's habit, the cold of alien fingers. Morning brought only sticky fear and a burning sensation on her skin. She wrote with a trembling hand, hiding words in cipher, weaving them into innocent lines. She sent a message to her father, William de Fours. He read, his eyes darkening. "My daughter speaks of things that cannot be named," he wrote to King Edward III, "of sisters who come to her bed at night and do unholy things." The abbess's voice was soft, sweet as honey, but cold as ice. "Your daughter has gone mad from religious fervor." But William saw. He saw the bruises on her body, dark, indistinct marks on pale skin. He saw the wild, hunted fear in her eyes, widened to blackness. His fists clenched. "I will not leave her in this place of depravity," he roared, and that roar echoed throughout the kingdom. Medical care, if it could be called that, was primitive, dangerous, and often cruel. Children who fell ill were treated with bloodletting, purgatives, and prayer. At Wilton Abbey, the infirmary was a small stone room, windowless, only a blank wall. The air here was heavy, stagnant, smelling of urine, sweat, and decay. There was almost no heating. The cold permeated to the bone. Sick children were isolated from the community, left alone with their illness. They lay on straw pallets, coughing, moaning, gasping, quietly, almost soundlessly. To recover or to die, the choice was theirs. And God's intervention, minimal, almost none. The Abbey chronicler, Sister Matilda, wrote in 1245, her quill scratching on parchment, leaving traces of pain. "Little Constance," she penned, "suffers from a fever that burns her flesh. A hot, dry heat. Her breathing rapid, shallow. The girl was delirious, her lips whispering strange, unintelligible words. Matilda felt the heat radiating from her tiny body, applying a cold, damp cloth to her burning forehead. We bled her 3 times, she continued, recalling the metallic stench, the red drops flowing down a pale arm, and gave bitter herbs. Their taste was foul, acrid, astringent. But Constance weakened. With each hour, with each breath, the abbess, her voice flat, dispassionate as a funeral bell, pronounced, "It is God's will. Perhaps her suffering will buy grace for all of us." A heavy silence hung in the air, filling everything. Herbal medicine. Some older nuns practiced it, but always mixed it with superstition and ancient, dark rituals. At Amesbury Abbey, Sister Beatus, the herbalist, kept detailed records. Her handwriting was neat, precise. "For fever in children," she wrote, "mix wormwood with holy water and consecrated salt. The scent of wormwood, bitter, pungent, mingled with the faint aroma of holy water, the whisper of prayers. If the child continues to burn," she continued, "apply leeches to the temples, reciting 50 Hail Marys. Slippery, cool creatures. Trembling lips, whispering prayers, merging into a monotonous, lulling drone. If the fever breaks," her hand was firm, "give praise to Saint Dionysius. Hope, a brief moment of relief. If the child dies," and here there was no shadow of doubt, no shadow of sorrow, "give praise to God for calling another innocent soul to heaven." Cold, impeccable acceptance. A profound, penetrating cold. It seeped under the skin, settled in the bones, twisting nerves into tight knots. Isolation, like a thick, sticky fog, suffocated every breath, preventing them from straightening their shoulders, from breathing deeply. Violence. Its echo rang in their ears, leaving behind only a tremor, invisible yet palpable, as if frayed nerves snapped at the slightest touch. The children, those few who survived, who reached adulthood, carried this tremor within them. It manifested in everything, in the inability to touch another person, to build a bridge connecting hearts, every closeness, a searing fear. Every glance, suspicion, nightmares. They came with twilight, filling sleep with screams, clangs, the scent of dampness and hopelessness, anxiety. It was a constant companion, an invisible weight on their chests, never allowing a moment of relaxation. Depression. It drained the colors from the world, leaving only a grey, monotonous backdrop, devoid of joy or hope. Lady Margaret Bowett, who spent 3 years at Maxtoke Priory from 14 to 17, wrote in her personal prayer book. Her handwriting was steady, but the words cut like a cold blade. "I am 30 years old. 30 years. And still, when the cathedral bell begins its heavy, slow toll, I wake, in terror. My heart beats against my ribs like a trapped bird. A cold sweat breaks out on my skin. An icy trickle runs down my spine. Each strike, boom, boom, like a hammer on an anvil, reverberates in my skull, knocking the air from my lungs. I still count the hours between meals. 1, 2, 3. Hunger. It was always there, burning, relentless, and even now, it twists my stomach, even when the table groans with delicacies. I still find myself moving silently through my own home, like a ghost. Every creak of the floorboards, every rustle of fabric, they might bring punishment. I listen to every sound, freezing, awaiting a blow. The child I was in that place is dead. Her laughter, her dreams, her belief in goodness, all of it died there, beyond the priory walls. But her ghost, it haunts every moment of my life, whispers in my ear, breathes down my neck, never lets go. Some children tried to escape, desperately, through pain, through fear. Few succeeded. At Godstow Abbey, a girl named Mabel of Gloucester attempted to escape in 1278. She hid in a cart. The scent of damp hay, sharp, dry, tickled her nostrils. The straw pricked her skin, dug through the thin fabric of her dress. Every bump in the road, a jolt to her body, to her head. Breathing was difficult. The air was stale, dusty. But ahead, freedom. Oxford, hope. It pulsed in her temples, drowning out fear, drowning out hunger, drowning out pain. She was caught, returned, cast out, an underground cell. Cold, damp stone. It clung to her cheeks, to her palms. The air heavy, humid, with a taste of earth and hopelessness. The space narrowed, pressed on her chest. No breath, no sound. Only her own ragged breathing, hoarse, strained. Hunger. It didn't just gnaw at her stomach. It corroded her from within, dissolving thoughts. Darkness, complete, unyielding. It enveloped, pressed down. 3 months. 3 months in darkness, in cold, on the verge of death. When she was finally released, the other children whispered that she had lost the ability to speak coherently. Words melted, scattered like sand through her fingers. She swayed, back and forth and back, humming aimlessly, a quiet, monotonous sound, like the moan of wind through empty pipes. Alice of Normandy, who served as abbess at Malling Abbey, kept detailed records. Her diary, the pages rustled, heavy, smelling of ink and authoritative calm. Within it, entries. Young Marie tried to scale the walls during matins. Her fingers slipped on the rough stone, clinging to projections. She fell. A dull thud, a scream, a crunch. Broke her arm. I consider this God's punishment for her disobedience. Catherine attempted to hide in the hay carts, bound for Canterbury. The scent of fresh grass, a soft bed, hope. She was discovered, returned, for proper correction. Isabella feigned illness to avoid morning prayers, hoping to get into the infirmary and then escape. The scent of herbs, whispers. She waited. All these attempts reveal the same evil, an unwillingness to submit to God's plan for their lives. The most heartbreaking aspect. Not just the facts, but how systematically these children were broken. They arrived here as individuals, each with her own character, her own preferences, her own small, timid dreams. They were transformed into empty vessels for religious piety. Their spirit, it was crushed under the weight of absolute obedience, the sound of shattered glass. It was silent, but its shards remained forever within, sharp, cold, unbearable. At Barking Abbey, where the air always smelled of wax and old stone, the chronicler, Sister Euphemia, bent over her parchment. The scratch of her goose quill was the only sound breaking the dense silence, and in every stroke there was a strange, almost jubilant satisfaction. She wrote, "Young Lady Philippa arrived last spring, full of worldly pride and stubborn will. Her laughter rang too loudly, and the rustle of her silk dresses sometimes drowned out even our prayers. She often spoke of her finery, of how smoothly silk glided against her skin, and of her beloved falcon whose bells jingled in her memories. Today, however, she knelt before me, and the dull thud of her knees against the cold stone resonated in every corner of the abbey. Her voice was hoarse with supplication. She begged forgiveness for her former vanity. She asked that her beautiful hair be shorn even shorter, and I saw the scissors gleam as they severed the shining strands. She requested that her food be further reduced, and I felt the keen hunger that was now her companion. She asked for additional penances, and I knew her flesh would burn with every strike. God has subdued her rebellious heart. This was not knowledge. It was not light. It was a slow, inexorable destruction. Every word, every glance, every breath, all worked to erase individuality, to erase what made a person themselves. The children, they learned that their own thoughts were a snare, dangerous, sinful, that their emotions, rotten fruits, poisoning the soul, that their bodies, mere vessels of shame, filled with disgrace. It was hammered into their heads that reason was an enemy, feelings, traitors, that only complete blind obedience saved, obedience that pressed down like a stone slab, leaving no room for questions, for sighs, for life. At Romsey Abbey, where the air was even thicker with the scent of incense and old leather, the novice mistress, Dame Scholastica, penned her instructions. Her handwriting was as stern as her gaze. Every letter a chiseled decree. She wrote, "A child must be taught